maybe shouldn't ask you questions as it's about to start, but
no worries. Hi, everybody, and welcome. We're just chatting away here beforehand, and we're sorry to start a little bit late. It was a technology issue on my side, but I'm very excited to have Alexis Landau, the author of Those Who Are Saved, joining us here on Ask an Author today. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Good, doing very well. Well, I was telling you before we started, I'm very excited to talk to you about this book, partially because of some personal connections to the place that it's set in. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your book and what readers can expect.
Yeah. Well, the book is primarily about a mother searching for her daughter during World War II, spanning from 1940 to 1945, set in France and Los Angeles. And it follows 3 points of view. The first is Vera, who is the mother who has to escape France at the last minute and ends up coming to the US and moving to Los Angeles with her husband, Max. But they leave behind their 4-year-old daughter, Lucy, who is 4 when the book starts. And then we get to follow her point of view, which is interwoven in the story. And she's moved to a convent and has to assume a new identity. And we see that through her eyes. And then the third point of view is Sasha, who is a young writer-director in Hollywood. But he actually goes off to fight in the war. So their timelines are parallel, and then ends up connecting with Vera in the book. They have a love affair and they go back together to try to find Lucy at the end.
Wonderful. Well, there's a lot that I thought was just fascinating about this book, in part because it's a different part of World War II history than I've seen often portrayed in recent fiction. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what makes this unique, and maybe a little bit more about the creative community that forms around this book?
Yeah, definitely. And that was a big inspiration for the book, and what sort of started me off writing it was this world of exiles here in Los Angeles who, were some of the most celebrated like writers and composers and filmmakers from Europe, a lot from Berlin, but all over really, escaping fascism. And a lot of them ended up here in LA, and kind of created this new, somewhat fragile, exile community in Pacific Palisades and Santa Monica Canyon and Brentwood, and all of these places that are very familiar to me as I grew up there. And it's just really interesting juxtaposition in terms of what they left behind and all that they were haunted by, because obviously knowing that what was going on in Europe while they were here in this very sort of like glamorous and somewhat, paradise-like setting, and that sort of that tension with what they knew was happening and also what they had to leave behind. So I was just really interested in that view of the war that, most of us don't really think about as much, in terms of the people who are here and had to leave behind so much, and how they built new lives for themselves. And, some were very successful and were able to adapt really well, like Thomas Mann. But then even within the same family, his brother really struggled, Henrik Mann, to adjust and to publish and to, succeed. So there was always this also tension within the community itself in terms of who was sort of thriving and able to, I guess, look forward and not back, and who couldn't do that.
I think it's interesting that within the same family at the center of this book, so Vera and her husband, you have a little bit of a sense of the looking back versus looking forward. Can you talk a little bit about the dynamics within that relationship, especially around the decision to leave, but even before then, the decision to kind of put their daughter into what they really thought was the safest situation? Maybe you unpack a little bit of that for people who are taking a look at this book.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely wanted to show within the dynamic of Vera and Max's marriage that Max was just the more optimistic one and more hopeful and not as worried and not as, I guess, sort of thinking of worst case scenario. Whereas Vera, from the minute that they knew they would have to report to an internment camp and what to do with Lucy was like much more like, I don't know how this is going to end. Mm-hmm. And then of course, when they do have to leave, it's almost like her worst case scenario is fulfilled. And she just never, feels like, comfortable with the situation at all, even, before certain events happen. And I think her husband is trying to hold it together. And it's not like he's not feeling the anxiety or the grief, but he's trying to survive in his own way and get through, the uncertainty and the loss. And basically, he is much more forward looking. And even when there's a possibility that Lucy is still alive and in Europe and they need to find her, Max kind of shuts down and can't feel the hope, because having hope is a dangerous thing. And it can be even more heartbreaking if you allow yourself to hope. But, Vera, she just doesn't have a choice. She's kind of compelled, I think, by this maternal instinct or love, or however you want to describe it, to believe that her daughter is still out there somewhere.
It's really interesting because I think within that dynamic, it plays out beautifully against the backdrop of the larger group of people, the expat community, where you have throughout the book very conflicting ideas of, how invested people should be in being in Los Angeles and creating a life there, how much they should be. It's not that they're not concerned about what's going on back home, but it's almost sort of, I imagine, a defense mechanism to not engage as much with the reports that are coming back from Europe, because the life they're leading in Los Angeles is very, very different. I mean, this is a very privileged group of people who kind of create this enclave for themselves.
Yeah, definitely. There's a moment in the book where Vera is just really sort of overcome with anxiety about, what's happened in Pearl Harbor hasn't even happened yet, I don't think. And she's just like, what if the Germans, occupy all of France, and like, what will happen to Lucy? And she just kind of can't, like, she's paralyzed by that anxiety. And her friend and confidant, Elsa, is basically like, we are all thinking that, but we can't, like, just let it weigh us down too much, because we won't survive then. It was a defense mechanism or a coping mechanism. And so, they did really strive to create a sense of home, or, Berlin on the Pacific or whatever, like just have like these gatherings and try to find a sense of community, while knowing that so many of their family, friends, relatives were, being just under the worst conditions. And so it was, again, it created this really odd and jarring dissonance for just the whole, idea of, we're in this beautiful place, but these terrible things are happening. And the guilt also of that privilege of being able to not be in the war directly, but seeing it from afar, and like all those things, and some of the writers felt it much more on more of a sort of political way. Like Thomas Mann was always, he felt this sense of that Germany should take responsibility, and he was very outspoken and against fascism, and took it upon himself to really make a much more public stand, whereas others were just dealing with their own personal, guilt, which is more like what Vera's wrapped up in.
Sure. When it comes to Los Angeles and this group of people, why was it that they were attracted to this particular place? I mean, we also spend a little bit of time in New York as well, where there's also a community that's formed there. But what do you think it was about LA during that period of time that kind of drew people to it?
Well, I definitely think the draw of Hollywood was a big one, especially in terms of employment. And a lot of those writers or composers got contracts almost because they were refugees. And a lot of the studio bosses, you know, had Jewish roots. So there was a sense of kind of like helping out. And, you know, it was unstable though. Like they might have had a contract for only a year and then had to scramble, but at least it was something. And a lot of them didn't want to be doing that. You know, they had composed for amazing, you know, orchestras, or, you know, they wrote like really intellectual novels and now they were writing screenplays. But, and they, some of them, you know, which I do show in my book, you know, mocked that or whatever, but it was a life, it was a way to survive. So that was one reason. And the other reason, which Alex Ross wrote an amazing article on this community in the New Yorker. I actually have it right here. And it's called, yeah, Exodus. And it's actually from a year ago, but you could probably find it online. The other reason that he actually gives, which makes sense, is that there was less of an infrastructure in terms of the artistic community in LA, and New York was sort of already claimed by, you know, other emigres. And so there was a sense of like, well, let's start over here on our own, and we don't have to compete with the other luminaries that have already been established in New York.
Sure, it's interesting since both of us are from Los Angeles and have, it sounds like a lot of commonalities in terms of places we know. It's interesting because I think sometimes it's so tempting to think of Hollywood and Los Angeles as this sort of fixed thing that is as we know it, but the reality is it was developing and changing so rapidly. It was a huge boom town in the early 20th century, right? So yeah. There would be that sense that, you know, you could kind of go and write a bit of your own, you know, history into the city, because you're not necessarily dealing with Broadway and all of the history in New York or even Chicago. I think would have felt very different than Los Angeles.
Yeah, and a lot of the architects went to Chicago, and like a lot of the writers were already in New York. And so there was like this unclaimed territory out here. And that's also in part what draws Sasha to the West Coast, is like, you can make yourself over and, you know, in your own image or in a new image, and no one knows you. And there's not as much, you know, tradition or judgment or any of those things. At least that's how it used to be. So it's kind of this sense of freedom that maybe the East Coast has less of.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Sasha up, because I don't want to skim over his side also. So can you talk a little bit more about sort of who he is? And he's in a bit of a unique situation. He's not an emigre in the sense that these people who we've been talking about are. He's not a recent emigre, but he and his mother came over from Europe when he was much younger. So he is very American in a lot of ways. And I think his attitudes and his mindsets are much more American than maybe we might assume based on the fact that he is an immigrant.
Yeah, exactly. And I did want to show that sort of American dream, or like, you know, mentality, like you can come from anywhere and make it, that he really encapsulates. And this hope or belief in the future, you know, he comes over in the late 20s, or I think 1925, with his mother from Russia, and, you know, grows up on the Lower East Side and kind of like scraping himself up, you know, or pulling up from the bootstraps or whatever. And it is a really different immigrant experience, you know, compared to Vera and Max, who, you know, felt very settled, very assimilated in Paris, and never expected that they would have to leave. So they are sort of always like almost, or at least she is, in constant shock, you know, that she's here and it's so different, and she never imagined this for herself, and so many other things like that. Whereas he is like, yeah, this is what I want. You know, this is my dream. I'm going for it, you know, so he's looking forward and she's looking back. And so it felt like they needed to meet in order for her to look forward and for him to look back at his past.
Yeah. I have a question here, and please do drop questions into the comments, because we'll be sprinkling those through the conversation. Anne has asked, what made you decide to have a viewpoint from Lucy, who's our third point of view character, Vera's daughter?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. She wasn't actually, I think I started writing the book not with her point of view in. And then I think I just was like, let me experiment, because I sort of felt like this need to have Lucy's voice in there. And once I started writing from her point of view, it really took hold, and it flowed out, like in some ways much more easily than some of the other characters. And I just loved being able to write from a child's point of view and that challenge, but at the same time, seeing her grow and expressing that like growing awareness of herself and the world and who she is, and sort of like the tragicness of it, where she starts off at 4 and you're thinking like, okay, like she's still pretty small, but then by the time she's 9, she's pretty different. She's been through a lot. So I just really liked so the simplicity and immediacy of a child's point of view, because they don't think as much about like, oh, now it's towards the end of the war and what's happening. They're sort of more like focused on like just what's in front of them, the sensory details, their emotions, things like that.
Was it challenging writing these 3 very different characters who obviously, one is male, 2 are female, 2 are sort of are older, and 1 is a child? Were there challenges in balancing the writing process doing that, or trying to balance the story?
Yeah, I think the hardest part was showing how Vera and Sasha connect, because they're from such different backgrounds. And they are so different, and it feels somewhat unexpected because she's, wrapped up in her grief over her daughter. And, it seems, not quite like, oh, that she would be able to fall in love at that point. And for him too, he's very ambitious, and he's on his, path to becoming a director, and he's very caught up in that. But I think that having their wounds like dovetail each other, in the sense of she's lost something very recently, her daughter, and it's very much on the surface, and her grief is really raw. And he's actually lost his father, that he's buried and not wanted to look at for a long time. And there's a lot of shame around that. And so they both kind of help each other through those, I guess, searches or issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. You really get a sense that they sort of are each looking for something, and the other complements that, but also kind of their pain is complementary as well, right? Which means, of course, their healing would have to be as well. It's really kind of a lovely way to frame the story.
Yeah, and sometimes like when a couple loses a child or is dealing with something like that, that's very, grief ridden and intense. It's almost like they can't always be a comfort to each other, like Max and Vera, for example, because their pains are like the same, and then they might be dealing with it in really different ways and not understanding that about each other, like maybe they're on a different, through the 7 stages of grief, whatever. Max might be in the denial stage or not want to think about it, pushing it away, and Vera's in the, rage or the grief, and so they're just totally out of sync. And it can be really tragic because, obviously then the marriage suffers or falls apart because of that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I also just wanted to show that sometimes, having that outside person come in who, it's not so painful for Sasha to think about what she lost, or it's more possible for him maybe to have hope than for mom, for example. Yeah.
I want to be sure to ask you about research, because it's one of the most common questions that readers tend to ask on these talks. And I think every book kind of shows that there's different dimensions to research, and you can go in different ways. And this one, I think, being set predominantly in California, is going to have different things that you're looking at and drawing on. So can you talk a little bit about sort of where you started with this book, when you sat down and you decided you wanted to write it? Well, if you had the idea already when you kind of started doing the research, what were you looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I mean, the first impetus were the exiles and that community. And it was just like when I discovered how close it was, and I could go visit Villa Aurora and like walk around the grounds and like see, Leon Feuchtwanger's desk and all of these objects and things. that really brought it to life. But then in terms of, you know, all the books, I cast a really wide net at first, and that's always how I approach research. And again, it was something that was so sort of right there in front of me because I teach at USC and they have this amazing exile studies library where they had these special collections that were like full of oral histories and archives and photos from the exiles, and particularly Leon and Martha Feuchtwanger that the Freudenbergers are modeled after. And so I spent hours in the special collection room. You know, you can't like bring, I don't know, water in there, and you can't touch anything. You know, anywhere. Take your notes on an index card. I don't think I could even use my computer if I'm remembering right. You know, so it was, but I love that. Like I probably would have been a librarian in another life, but and so again, it was like just so accessible. It was like right there. So that was one aspect of the research. And then for Sasha and all of this sort of early, you know, like Hollywood golden years, golden age, not golden years, that sounds like much older. Anyway, that was an aspect of the research that I was not as familiar with. And film history is so vast, and you can spend years, you know, reading about different productions and what happened and like, you know, the studio system. And so you know, there were a few like really key books that, you know, laid the groundwork for that, like City of Nets, or Five Came Back, which is about directors in Hollywood who went to war and then came back to work in Hollywood, that were really instrumental. And Sam Fuller, who was a great director in Hollywood, went to fight too. So I read like his biography. So there was just like all of this, and I loved that. And my husband studied film in college, so he helped me too. And would talk to me about, you know, the kind of lens they would use. What? Sorry.
Wonderful to have a research assistant on a book.
Yeah, no, I mean, he got a little annoyed when I kept saying, you know, well, what would they do in this case? But he also loves to talk about it. So that would be like for Sasha, you know, so each character brought its own trove of research. And then Lucy was really, really interesting too, because there was this whole other aspect of the war where it was the hidden children who had their identities erased and had to assume these new ones. And depending on how old they were, you know, it would be pretty risky for a 4-year-old, you know, to hope that they don't say the wrong thing if someone came to check out the convent or whatnot. And just the immense pressure and sort of alienation and abandonment that these children suffered. And that is a whole history in and of itself, which is really interesting. And my husband is actually from Holland, and we went there, you know, I guess it was a few years ago, and one of his older family friends, who's, you know, in her 80s now, it was sort of sent chills down my spine because she was telling me, without knowing that I was writing this book, that she was just telling about old stories and how during the war she hid another girl who became like her hiding sister, which is like the term for it. And, you know, they just pretended that this girl hiding in their farm was part of the family, you know, until it was time to bring, you know, her parents. I think she was reunited with her parents, but and that kind of helped me think about the relationship between Lucy and Camille, and how Camille is like a sister and also somewhat of a mother figure too, because she's a little bit older, and she takes Lucy under her wing. It's kind of the thing that keeps Lucy going.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. There's so many different dynamics going on in this book, and so many different perspectives. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I'm so glad to see in books, is when there's shifts in attitudes. So, you know, there are real significant events that change people's perspectives. And I think one of the things that, again, you know, we can kind of forget is that we see the war as this entity. It had a beginning and an ending, but people then didn't know when the end was going to come. You know, different events and different things changed. And so you can see through, you know, whether it's newspaper editorials or, you know, diaries, or even, you know, people looking back through oral history, recalling what it was that they felt at various points in time. And so one of the things that I thought was really interesting with Lucy is you have a lot of different people influencing what happens to her in her life, who think they're doing the right thing, who think the war is going to, unfurl in a certain direction. And, obviously not everybody gets it right by any means. And not everybody is also doing the right thing for the right reasons, maybe, at least from my perspective. And I don't want to spoil too much because I know that's getting into really towards the end of the book. But it is interesting to see how that unfolds throughout this period of time.
Yeah, no, definitely that, kind of suspension of knowledge of what we know in terms of, what happened, or, we all know, okay, 1944, like the war's almost over, but they didn't know that. And then it really didn't seem like it was, because there was a whole horrible winter following and everything that happened in the spring of 45. And there's this amazing book called The Last Million by David Nassau about the sort of period between the end of World War II and the Cold War, and how many people, millions, were left in the DP camps, who had been liberated from camps, or like, let's say Lucy just ended up, there without anywhere else to go, and were there for years, some until 48, 47, just waiting for a visa to the US or to emigrate somewhere else. Their homelands were no longer their homes. And, I think, it makes sense that we would, just from the way that people think about things, like, as you said, as a finite entity, that we're like, oh, the war is over, like V-Day, everyone's happy. Right. But there was this huge traumatic aftermath. And even for the exiles here, what I found really interesting was almost the minute the war ended, they became targets of McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and were suddenly seen as like communists, and, Jews and communists, like those two things were not good after the war. And some of them, just returned back to Europe because they were like seeing a rise in the very thing that they tried to escape, and just that pendulum of history for me is always just so interesting, how things can just shift so quickly.
Yeah. And people not necessarily finding a home in
right.
that they thought perhaps this will be, they have work in the studios, they have,
right.
homes, they had a community, and all that gets upended again when
right.
the war ends.
Yeah. And even in terms of like Vera's character, I think part of the reason why she was sort of reluctant to leave France to begin with, or sort of like didn't quite like get what was going on, is that, she had already been, an immigrant from Russia and during the revolution as a child. So she sort of like grabbed on to her identity as French over anything else, and over being Jewish, over whatever. And so when that happened, it was like almost like cognitive, impossibility to say, oh, wait, now I'm not, this isn't my home anymore, And so I think, especially for like highly assimilated Jews, it was almost unthinkable that, Berlin or Vienna, whatever, like was going to be taken away from them. And sometimes I contrast them with like, people like Sasha's, family or whatever, who were much more accustomed to persecution and pogroms and so forth. So they weren't as assimilated in Europe. So they might have been like, oh yeah, we got to pack up and go again, So it's kind of like, yeah, like you were saying, this idea of home and thinking, this is my home now, it's okay, I'm safe here. And then, no, actually I'm not, is very painful.
Absolutely. One of the kind of common questions that I know I get a lot, and I'm always curious to hear from other authors, is at what point did you kind of go from research to writing? And then did you continue? I imagine you have to, on some level, continue to research throughout writing the book, but was it sort of a more drips and drabs, or was it, you kind of took breaks and decided, okay, now I need to learn more about, what happened to hidden children in France? And
right. I feel like I did a big chunk of sort of Vera and Lucy's research all at once in the beginning. And I did already know a lot about like Vera's journey, I guess, because I had written my dissertation for my PhD on Irina Muravsky, who's a French Jewish writer, from Russia, living in Paris. So I kind of understood, but she didn't get out, and ended up, perishing at Auschwitz. So it was almost like I knew at least Vera's context, background, mindset, like when that was all happening and the war started. So, that was sort of already very much in my, working memory. And like Lucy too, that was sort of part of that world to investigate. I had that sort of settled before I started writing. But then Sasha was harder because of the film history and like, what is it like to be on a set? How do you set up a project? What's Louis B. Mayer's office like? And so that was really fun, but it was also like, oh my God, like I have to stop writing and take like 2 months to read or to whatever. And like furiously trying to like seep in so I could write, and I listened to this podcast, which was amazing. Oh God, now I can't remember the name of it, but about old Hollywood.
Was
and
it You Must Remember This by any chance?
sorry.
Was it You Must Remember This?
Yes.
That's a great podcast, and
Yeah.
I've just got my brother-in-law hooked on listening to it. So
Yeah, and her voice is so captivating, and so I think for like months I listened to that constantly. I was just like, even if it goes to the 60s or what, it doesn't matter. I just like soaked it all in. So yeah, that was really great too. So yeah, you're right. Like it was like a stop and start thing, but I think you have to have, at least for my experience, enough under your belt to have the confidence to start. It's really nerve-wracking to start anyway. And so, not having any research or sort of just being like, oh, this is what I couldn't do that. But
no, I can certainly understand that. There's a moment where you think, okay, there's enough that at least I can get going, and then I'll have to supplement, but I don't feel quite so lost now.
yeah, or I might have to have taken a day to just research what was it like to cross the Pyrenees, and this, and like what was the topography, and like how long did it take. But it's not, that took maybe 4 hours as opposed to 4 months or something like that. So you kind of know, okay, this area is going to take a lot longer. Sorry, I'm just closing the window. Take a month or whatever it is, and like allow yourself that time. But at the same time, it can be a procrastination tool,
Absolutely
unconsciously, to
Not
say
that we've ever done that.
right, like, oh, I need more on that. And because it is scary to start writing, or even once you have started, to like stop and go back and start again. The blank page is always sends my heart racing.
Yeah. How do you tackle your writing routine then? What is it that are you writing every day, or?
Right now I am, yeah, and not on the weekends, but
Right.
every day from like 1 to 6, which is great. And I'm really thankful for it. And it's only possible because there's a babysitter taking care of my kids in the afternoon. And, so that's been really a godsend. So yeah, but before that, like there's a lot of life, like chaos. There's dogs that get sick, and like orthodonture appointments and retainers that get lost, and all the really annoying things.
It sounds like a very specific example that may have actually happened.
Oh yeah, I'm just throwing it all in right now. And we're all on top of each other and working from home. So yeah, someone's taking a call in this room, I hear that. But that time is so important to carve out and make your own boundaries, because if you don't make them, especially as a mother, they just collapse.
Sure.
Because if you're available, then they just rush in and ask for a million things. So it's
writing time.
Yeah, and I sometimes I go somewhere else to write, and that really helps. But you can't always do that. So it's good. It's very like defined, when it starts, when it ends. And it's one of those things that I can't do, at least while I'm doing other things. I mean, sure. I don't like writing, Whereas my husband's job, like he's on the phone, he's checking an email, he's like doing something, it's just much more like fluid. Whereas I'm like, no one can say anything to me in these hours, unless it's like you're bleeding,
Right, exactly.
Right. But that's basically my routine. And when I taught before the pandemic, and I would go to USC and teach, that would be kind of nice, because then I would just go to the library there and write for a few hours. It was harder to write every day because of teaching and other things. But in a way, it was like really nice to have contact with other humans, and be able to talk and, see young people and their ideas. So I kind of miss that. And writing is already isolating, so I think it balances well with teaching if, that's something people want to do. But I don't know. But on the other hand, it's been really great to have all this time to write and think and, start something new and not feel, I don't know, like so on the clock, where you have the teaching and the kids and this and the dog and husband and, kind of feel
and put together a writing schedule out of
right. It's like a Jenga tower, and then you're like, wait, what piece is gonna fall next?
that feeling.
Yeah.
Christine's wondering if you can talk about what it is that you're working on right now. Are you able to share that with us, or is that a secretive project?
No, I'm happy to share it. It's a really different project. It's not, I guess, historical fiction in the traditional sense. It's set during, like, now, it's contemporary, but it does have historical roots, actually reaching back to Greco-Roman times, and the mystery religions, which is, anyway, really fascinating to me. I was a religion major in college, so there's some things coming back, and kind of the idea of, like, feminism and spirituality, and how patriarchal a lot of major religions are. So that's some of it. It's also about mom rage, which definitely has increased during the pandemic.
I was going to say, this is very topical right now.
Yeah, which was not on purpose, but it actually it grew out of my experience being a single mom for almost 6 months, which was not expected. But my husband had to go to Bulgaria, of all places, for a movie. And I wanted to support him as, like, a good wife, right? But then I was, like, left with my 2 kids and trying to write and teach. And it was just insane, And I think I just really got so angry, thinking I could never do that as a mom, just leave for 6 months. I mean, I can't even imagine what that would look like, And so it's like the book is a lot about the rage and also the grief underneath the rage, and guilt, and a lot of things that I think mothers experience. And also during the pandemic now, I mean, every article I read is just about how mothers and women are just completely stretched so thin, and everything is.
Times that did that long feature piece a couple of weeks ago about kind of the primal scream of mothers in the US. Yeah, well, mothers everywhere, I think.
Right. And London too. I mean, I have one of my close friends is living in London, and her kids are home, and, she's trying to work, and it just feels like, for the most part, I don't want to generalize, but that it's the women who are keeping things running, and teaching their kids and cooking and doing all this and trying to, maintain their careers. And it causes a lot of rage to just be like, how did this happen? How did we get set back like 40 years or whatever, more than that? Second wave feminism was supposed to be solving this.
Right.
So anyway, sorry, I could go on. This is very, like, emotional for me. So
no, it's a good thing. I think when you strike on a topic or a theme that really hits you very, it's something that you can become very passionate about. It comes through in the writing, and it's sort of as difficult as I imagine it can be sometimes to sit down and write about this with everything going on right now. I imagine it's impactful when, and powerful when it comes to getting it down on the page.
Yeah, it's cathartic. And Yeah, I mean, it's I have been thinking a lot about the rage, and then what's beneath rage is often grief, and the two kind of go together. So, and it's also like, okay, we feel a lot of rage, but then what? I mean, I don't really feel like reenacting the Bacchae myself, putting heads on spikes or what. That's not really the solution. And so it's kind of like, all right, how do we negotiate this? How do we, ask for more, not feel so guilty, stake our claims, get our husbands, a lot of them seem pretty progressive on the surface, but, to contribute more and carry more to the emotional labor, all of those things that so many articles are, talking about, especially now, because the pandemic's just, I think, shown a light on all the cracks in society, so.
Yeah. No, it's really caused a lot of people to step back and ask whether what they've been doing is what they really want.
Yeah, exactly. And just dynamics and old patterns and thinking, okay, this isn't working. And before we were so distracted, there was so much going on. We didn't really, have time or maybe the space to think about it as much. But now it's kind of like there's been this huge pause button. And, I think a lot of people are like, okay, I don't want to just, when this is over, whenever that is, or, vaccinated or however that looks, just to be like, oh, that was horrible. Now it's over. Like, I hope that everyone learns something from this. I'm definitely trying to learn from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you, not to switch off of topics, but I did want to ask you a little bit about books and about your reading. And one of the reasons is because I actually highlighted in my copy here a quote from the book, which is, "She couldn't think without her books. The collection reflected the inner workings of her mind, past obsessions, future ones, all accessible with one tour among the spines, her fingertips tracing the titles, as if gliding along piano keys, each book, each writer emanating a certain note that, when pressed, revealed a close breathing universe." I loved that sentiment, the idea that books are sort of a map to your intellectual curiosity, where you've been. There's optimism in owning books, I think, because, I think it's very safe to say I'm never going to be able to read as much as I would like to read. I would be very happily just reading away, and with all my days, and still not end up with reading all of those books. So I'm curious about sort of your relationship with reading, and how big a role that plays in your life, outside of obviously the research books and whatever you're reading for teaching as well.
Yeah, no, it is true exactly what you just said about how what we've read is kind of like, an intellectual biography or something of like where we've been, what we've thought, and sort of past obsessions and current ones and future ones. And so, I mean, I think it's interesting when I think about when I was younger, I read a lot of male writers, and Murakami or Updike or Fitzgerald, and I was like, oh, they're the masters, I will never aspire. Or Nabokov, like, what's the point of even writing? He's amazing. And then, like, more recently, I've noticed that like every single book is by a woman. I mean, not every single.
I'm finding that as well for myself.
Yeah, but a lot more. Like, it's like kind of like, whoa, the balance is really out of whack. And so, yeah, I'm reading like Tessa Hadley, who's actually an English writer, and Rachel Cusk is one of my absolute favorites. Like, I'm obsessed with her. Elena Ferrante, there's so many. Alice Munro was an early favorite and still is. I just Deborah Levy, who is also British, I think. I just read Things I Don't Want to Know and The Cost of Living. I just love her books, and it's such a different style than mine, at least so far. They're not historical. They're very contemporary. They're very much about, marriage, and I guess you could say feminism or motherhood. They all have this very dark sense of humor. I mean, not the Ferrante, but she does too, sort of, but Cusk and, Levy. And I'm right now, I did actually just finish a book by a man called A Lie Someone Told You About Yourself by Peter Hode Davies. And I loved it because it was a really honest portrayal of fatherhood, and it really did show his struggles. And I appreciated that. It was nice to see a father struggling.
Mhm.
Kind of like, oh, thank God, like it's not just on moms. And just to how he put that into prose was really beautiful. And yeah, so but I'm always, fiction, nonfiction, there's so much to read. I agree with you. And there's anxiety over what you choose to read because you don't have that much time, like life is finite. Like I know I'm going to die not having read certain books, and that's upsetting.
Yeah, I think at some point I had to reconcile myself to the idea that there were just going to be some books I was never going to read.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just the way it was going to be, whether it was, for lack of time, or some things are kind of in that middle to lower end of the pile where you just think, one day if I get to it, I'll get to it. And I realize that there's always things that I'd rather be reading. So maybe those I can let go of. So
No, that's true.
well, I would love to have you tell people where they can find your book, and also where they can find you online if they want to go ahead and stay in touch with you and learn more about what you have coming up.
Yeah. Well, I'm on Instagram. It's Alexis.Landau is the handle. And my website is alexislandau.com, all one word. And then, yeah, you can buy the book. I think it's out in the UK either today or tomorrow on, Amazon, your independent bookstore, wherever books are sold. So that's where you can find me. And yeah, it's been really great talking to you.
You too. Thank you so much for doing this, and for you guys who are watching, continue to ask questions within the Facebook group itself. Also, I'll be putting up future events, so keep an eye out for that. We have a lot of stuff coming up this spring. A lot of authors who've been requested by readers in the group. So hopefully that's a good surprise for you guys when those do come through. So thank you again for joining me. I really appreciate it. And again, congratulations on the book. It really is fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.